The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists from around the world gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood 17-year-old Tyler Morrison from Dallas, Texas, his expensive designer sneakers tapping impatiently against the stone ground. His father, a successful oil executive, had reluctantly agreed to this European vacation after Tyler's mother insisted their son needed cultural exposure before starting his senior year of high school. Tyler pulled out his latest iPhone, already live streaming to his 3,000 followers on social media. "What's up, guys? Your boy Tyler here, and I'm at this boring old palace in London. My mom dragged me here because she thinks I need to see some history or whatever." He rolled his eyes dramatically for the camera, completely oblivious to the disapproving glances from nearby tourists who could hear his loud commentary. The teenager had grown up in a world of privilege where money could solve most problems and respect was something he believed others should show him, not something he needed to earn. His father's wealth had always opened doors, and Tyler had learned to expect special treatment wherever he went. In his mind, this trip to London was just another inconvenience he had to endure before getting back to his real life of parties, expensive cars, and the constant validation of social media likes. As the crowd began to thicken around the palace gates, Tyler became increasingly frustrated with having to wait. He was used to VIP treatment at restaurants and clubs back home, where his father's connections meant never standing in lines or following the same rules as everyone else. The concept of patiently waiting with hundreds of other tourists for a ceremony that wouldn't even directly involve him seemed absurd to his entitled mindset. "This is ridiculous," he muttered loud enough for several families nearby to hear. "In America, we don't waste time with this medieval nonsense. These guys are probably just actors anyway, right? I mean, who still has kings and queens in 2024? An elderly British couple standing next to him exchanged meaningful glances, but they chose to remain silent rather than engage with the obviously disrespectful young man. They had seen plenty of tourists over the years, some respectful and curious about their traditions, others dismissive and rude. Tyler was clearly falling into the latter category, but they hoped he might quiet down once the ceremony began. The palace guards began their preparation for the ceremony, their movements precise and practiced after years of training and tradition. Each guard wore the iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat that had become symbols of British tradition recognized around the world. Their faces remained completely stoic, trained through months of rigorous discipline to maintain composure regardless of external circumstances. Tyler watched this preparation with growing impatience and disdain. In his social circle back home, showing emotion and reaction was everything. The idea of standing perfectly still and emotionless seemed not just boring, but actually stupid to his teenage mind. He began making comments to his phone camera, describing the guards as weird robots and grown men playing dress-up. "Look at these guys," he said into his phone, zooming in on one particular guard who stood perfectly motionless despite the growing crowd and noise around him. "They're literally just standing there like statues. What's the point? This is supposed to be impressive? My little brother could stand still better than this, and he's only 12. Several tourists began moving away from Tyler's vicinity, uncomfortable with his loud and disrespectful commentary. Parents pulled their children closer, not wanting them to witness such blatant rudeness toward what many considered a significant cultural tradition. Some visitors had traveled thousands of miles specifically to see this ceremony, viewing it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to witness centuries-old British heritage. As the actual ceremony began, the guards started their synchronized march, their movements perfectly coordinated after countless hours of practice. The precision was remarkable, with each step taken in perfect unison, each turn executed with military sharpness that spoke to years of dedicated training and discipline. The crowd watched in respectful silence, many taking photos and videos while maintaining appropriate distances and behavior. Tyler, however, saw this as the perfect opportunity to create what he considered entertaining content for his social media followers. He began moving closer to the guards, despite clear barriers and signs indicating where tourists should remain. His phone remained constantly recording as he provided a running commentary that grew increasingly disrespectful with each passing minute. "Check this out, guys," he whispered loudly into his phone. "I'm going to see if I can get one of these robot soldiers to break character. This is going to be epic content.
Make sure you're hitting that like button because this is about to get crazy. The teenager's plan was simple in his mind.
He would approach one of the guards and try various tactics to get a reaction. In his experience, everything was content, and getting a reaction from someone who was supposed to remain motionless would be the kind of viral moment that could boost his social media presence significantly. He had no concept of the historical significance of what he was witnessing or the personal sacrifice and dedication required of the guards who served in this ceremonial role.
What Tyler didn't understand was that these weren't actors or performers hired for tourist entertainment.
These were actual soldiers of the British Army, many of whom had served in active combat zones around the world. The Queen's Guard consisted of infantry regiments with distinguished military histories, and the men standing before him had undergone extensive training not just in ceremonial duties, but in actual military combat and defense. The guard Tyler had chosen as his target was Lance Corporal James Richardson, a 24-year-old soldier who had completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious Queen's Guard. His motionless stance represented not just ceremonial tradition, but years of military discipline and personal sacrifice in service to his country. The seemingly simple act of standing guard required intense mental focus and physical endurance that most civilians could never maintain. Tyler approached the barrier separating tourists from the guards, his phone held high and his voice growing louder as he began his attempt to provoke a reaction.
"Hey, statue man. Can you hear me in there? Do you actually do anything useful, or do you just stand there all day looking ridiculous?"
The crowd around him began to murmur with disapproval, but Tyler interpreted their attention as validation of his performance. He had never learned to distinguish between positive and negative attention, viewing any reaction as success. His followers' comments on the livestream were mixed, with some encouraging his behavior while others expressed embarrassment and urged him to stop. "Come on, buddy," Tyler continued, now speaking directly to Lance Corporal Richardson.
"Just give me a little smile. A wink.
Anything to show there's actually a human being under that ridiculous hat.
This whole thing is just for show anyway, right? Nobody actually takes this seriously anymore."
Several palace security officers began moving in Tyler's direction, but they maintained professional distance while assessing whether his behavior would escalate beyond verbal harassment. They had protocols for handling disruptive tourists, but they preferred to allow situations to de-escalate naturally when possible rather than creating larger disturbances that might affect other visitors' experiences. Tyler's father, Richard Morrison, was several yards away, deeply engrossed in a business call that he considered more important than supervising his son's behavior. As a successful executive, Richard had always believed that money and status were the primary measures of success, and he had inadvertently passed these values to his son without also teaching respect for others or appreciation for different cultures and traditions. The teenager's mother, Patricia Morrison, was browsing expensive jewelry in a nearby gift shop, more interested in finding luxury souvenirs than monitoring her son's conduct. Like her husband, she had grown accustomed to their wealth solving any problems Tyler might create, and she assumed that their privileged status would protect him from any serious consequences of his actions. As Tyler's harassment continued, Lance Corporal Richardson remained perfectly motionless, his training and professionalism preventing him from responding to the provocation. However, other guards and palace officials were beginning to take notice of the situation. The British military took their ceremonial duties very seriously, and interference with those duties was not tolerated regardless of the perpetrator's nationality or perceived social status. Tyler, emboldened by what he saw as success in getting attention, decided to escalate his behavior. He began making exaggerated gestures and facial expressions, mimicking what he thought were the guards' movements while providing mocking commentary for his social media audience. His voice grew louder and his movements more dramatic as he fed off the energy of his online viewers' reactions. "Look at this guy," Tyler announced to his phone camera while pointing directly at Lance Corporal Richardson.
"He's like a really expensive lawn ornament. I bet he doesn't even have thoughts in his head. Just standing there, probably thinking about tea and crumpets or whatever boring stuff British people think about." The cultural insensitivity of Tyler's comments began attracting attention from British tourists and locals who happened to be present. Many felt personally offended by his dismissive attitude toward their traditions and his stereotypical assumptions about their culture.
Some began taking their own videos of Tyler's behavior, though their intent was quite different from his own social media goals. What Tyler failed to realize was that his actions were being recorded by multiple sources beyond his own phone. Palace security cameras captured every moment of his behavior, and several tourists were documenting what they viewed as an example of disrespectful American tourist behavior. These recordings would later play a crucial role in the consequences that would follow his actions. The teenager's complete lack of awareness about the seriousness of his situation was perhaps the most striking aspect of his behavior. In his mind, he was simply creating entertaining content and pushing boundaries in the way he had been allowed to do his entire life. The concept that there might be real consequences for his actions, or that his behavior might be genuinely offensive to others, had never been properly instilled in him despite his 17 years of life. As the ceremony continued around him, Tyler's disruption began affecting other tourists' ability to enjoy and appreciate the historical tradition they had come to witness. Families with children found themselves having to explain why the young man was being so rude, while international visitors felt embarrassed by association due to Tyler's obvious American accent and stereotypical ugly American tourist behavior. Lance Corporal Richardson's continued professionalism in the face of Tyler's harassment was actually remarkable, demonstrating exactly the kind of discipline and dedication that the ceremony was meant to honor. His ability to maintain perfect composure while being verbally harassed showed the high standards and extensive training required of the Queen's Guard, making Tyler's mockery seem even more inappropriate and misguided. The situation was approaching a tipping point where palace officials would need to intervene more directly. Tyler's behavior had crossed from merely rude into actively disruptive, and his continued escalation suggested that he had no intention of stopping his harassment on his own. The consequences of his actions were about to become much more serious than he could possibly imagine, setting the stage for events that would completely change his perspective on respect, tradition, and the real meaning of service to something greater than oneself.
Tyler's harassment escalated dramatically when he decided that verbal mockery wasn't generating enough engagement from his online audience.
The comments on his livestream had become a mixture of encouragement from his usual followers and growing criticism from viewers who found his behavior increasingly offensive.
Rather than recognizing the negative feedback as a warning, Tyler interpreted the controversy as proof that he was creating compelling content that people couldn't ignore. "Alright guys, this isn't working," Tyler announced to his phone camera. "This robot soldier is too well programmed. Let me try a different approach."
What happened next would be the moment that transformed his London vacation from an annoying cultural obligation into a life-changing crisis that would follow him for years to come. Tyler stepped closer to the ceremonial barrier, ignoring the clearly posted signs in multiple languages that established boundaries for tourist behavior. He began making increasingly exaggerated movements, waving his arms dramatically in front of Lance Corporal Richardson's face while maintaining his running commentary.
"Come on, statue man. There's got to be a human being in there somewhere. What do I have to do to get a reaction?"
Several members of the crowd began actively discouraging Tyler's behavior, with one elderly gentleman approaching him directly. "Young man, you need to show some respect. These are real soldiers, not entertainment for your social media." Tyler turned toward the older man with obvious irritation, his phone still recording. "Look, Grandpa, I don't need advice from someone who probably doesn't even know how to use the internet. This is just harmless fun. Nobody's getting hurt here." The dismissive way he addressed the concerned citizen revealed the depth of his disrespect for authority and his complete inability to accept guidance from others. What Tyler didn't know was that the elderly gentleman was retired Colonel William Ashworth, a decorated veteran of the Falklands War who had deep personal connections to the military traditions Tyler was mocking. Colonel Ashworth's warning wasn't just the concern of a random tourist, but the professional assessment of someone who understood both military protocol and the potential consequences of interfering with active duty soldiers. Emboldened by his dismissal of the colonel's warning, Tyler decided to escalate his behavior even further. He began attempting to reach over the barrier toward Lance Corporal Richardson, not quite touching him but coming dangerously close while continuing his mocking commentary. "Maybe if I get a little closer, I can figure out how this thing works. Is there like a switch or something?" This was the moment when Tyler's actions crossed from disrespectful behavior into actual interference with military duties. Palace security protocols were clear about physical approach toward active guards, and Tyler's movements triggered immediate response from multiple security officers who had been monitoring the situation with growing concern. Two plainclothes protection officers approached Tyler from different angles, their movement coordinated and professional. Unlike the obvious palace guards in their red tunics, these officers wore civilian clothing and had been positioned throughout the crowd specifically to handle situations like this. Their training focused on threat assessment and rapid response to any behavior that might compromise security or interfere with ceremonial duties. "Sir, I need you to step back from the barrier immediately," Officer Sarah Mitchell announced in a firm but controlled voice. Her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, but Tyler's privileged background had never taught him to recognize or respect such authority when it came from someone he didn't perceive as important. Tyler turned toward Officer Mitchell with obvious annoyance, his phone still recording the entire interaction. "Excuse me? I'm just taking some pictures here. This is a public space, right? I'm not doing anything illegal." His response demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both his situation and the legal framework governing behavior around sensitive government facilities. "Sir, you are interfering with military personnel in the performance of their duties," Officer Mitchell replied, her professional demeanor never wavering despite Tyler's confrontational attitude. "I need to see your identification and you need to move away from this area immediately." The request for identification sent Tyler into a minor panic, though he tried to hide it behind continued bravado. His parents had always handled any official interactions in his life, and he had never been required to take personal responsibility for his actions with law enforcement or government officials. The reality that his behavior might have actual legal consequences was beginning to penetrate his entitled mindset for the first time. "Look, lady, you're overreacting here," Tyler said, his voice becoming noticeably higher-pitched as stress began affecting his composure. "I'm an American citizen, and my dad is a very important businessman. You can't just harass tourists for taking pictures. I know my rights." Officer Mitchell's partner, Sergeant David Thompson, had positioned himself to Tyler's other side during this conversation, effectively blocking the teenager's potential escape routes while maintaining a professional but increasingly serious demeanor. Sergeant Thompson had 20 years of experience dealing with difficult individuals, and he recognized Tyler's behavior as that of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Your nationality and your father's occupation are irrelevant here," Sergeant Thompson stated firmly. "You are currently in violation of the Protection of Government Buildings Act and the Public Order Act. You have been asked to comply with lawful instructions from authorized officers. Your cooperation is not optional." The mention of specific laws and potential charges created a moment of genuine fear in Tyler's expression, though he continued trying to maintain his defiant persona for his social media audience. His livestream had attracted hundreds of new viewers as word spread about the confrontation, with comments ranging from support for his standing up to authority to growing calls for him to apologize and comply with the officer's instructions. "This is insane," Tyler protested, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments earlier. "I'm just a tourist. I wasn't hurting anyone. That guard guy didn't even react, so obviously he wasn't bothered by it." His attempt to minimize his behavior showed a fundamental misunderstanding of military discipline and the professional requirements of the Queen's Guard. Officer Mitchell stepped closer, her expression becoming noticeably more serious. "Sir, the fact that Lance Corporal Richardson maintained his professional composure despite your harassment is a testament to his training and discipline, not an indication that your behavior was acceptable. These soldiers are trained to maintain their positions regardless of provocation, which makes your actions particularly reprehensible." The use of Lance Corporal Richardson's actual name and rank caught Tyler off guard, suddenly, making the guard seem like a real person rather than the anonymous figure Tyler had been treating as entertainment. For the first time, he began to grasp that his actions had targeted an actual individual with a name, a military rank, and a professional responsibility that Tyler's behavior had made more difficult to fulfill. Tyler's parents finally became aware of the situation when they noticed the growing crowd and the obvious presence of security officers near their son. Richard Morrison approached the scene with the confident stride of someone accustomed to using wealth and influence to resolve problems, while Patricia Morrison followed behind, her primary concern being the potential embarrassment to their family's reputation. "Officers, I'm Richard Morrison, Tyler's father," Richard announced with the authoritative tone he used in business negotiations. "I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly. My son is just a teenager, and teenagers sometimes make poor choices. Whatever damage has been done, I'm prepared to compensate appropriately." Richard's immediate assumption that money could solve the situation revealed exactly where Tyler had learned his entitled attitude. The idea that his son's behavior might have consequences that couldn't be purchased away was foreign to Richard's worldview, and his offer of compensation actually made the situation worse by demonstrating the family's belief that wealth should exempt them from accountability. Sergeant Thompson's expression became visibly more stern as he addressed Richard's intervention. "Mr. Morrison, your son's actions constitute serious breaches of security protocol around a sensitive government facility. This is not a civil matter that can be resolved through compensation. Your son will need to accompany us for formal questioning, and charges may be filed depending on our investigation." The mention of potential criminal charges sent Patricia Morrison into immediate panic mode. As someone who prided herself on maintaining her family's social standing in their affluent Dallas community, the thought of her son facing criminal prosecution in a foreign country was her worst nightmare. "Surely there's been some mistake," she pleaded. "Tyler would never intentionally break any laws. He's a good boy who just doesn't understand your customs here." Tyler watched his parents' growing distress with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine fear. Part of him enjoyed seeing his father's usual confidence shaken, as it validated his belief that his actions had been significant enough to create real impact. However, the teenager was also beginning to realize that this situation might have consequences beyond anything he had previously experienced in his sheltered life. The crowd around them had grown significantly, with many tourists recording the interaction on their phones. Unlike Tyler's initial recording, which had been intended for entertainment, these videos were being taken by people who viewed his behavior as an example of disrespectful tourist conduct that needed to be documented. Several British citizens in the crowd were sharing their recordings on social media with hashtags criticizing American tourist behavior. Lance Corporal Richardson continued to maintain his professional stance throughout the entire confrontation, his discipline and training allowing him to remain focused on his duties despite being the center of an increasingly chaotic situation. His continued professionalism served as a stark contrast to Tyler's behavior and highlighted the respect and dedication required of military service members. Officer Mitchell began explaining the formal procedures that would now need to be followed, her tone remaining professional but leaving no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "Tyler Morrison, you are being detained for questioning regarding potential violations of the Protection of Government Buildings Act and harassment of military personnel. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to legal representation." The formal reading of his rights marked the moment when Tyler's actions transformed from a social media stunt into an official legal matter with potential international implications. His American citizenship would not protect him from prosecution under British law, and his parents' wealth and influence carried no weight with British authorities who were responsible for protecting government facilities and military personnel. As Tyler was escorted away from the ceremony area, his phone was confiscated as potential evidence, cutting off his livestream and leaving his online audience to speculate about what would happen next. The teenager's last visible expression on camera was one of genuine shock and fear as the reality of his situation finally began to penetrate his entitled worldview. The incident had lasted less than 30 minutes from start to finish, but those 30 minutes would have repercussions that extended far beyond anything Tyler could have imagined when he first decided to create what he thought would be entertaining social media content. His actions had set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about privilege, respect, and the real consequences of treating others as objects for his entertainment. The detention facility at New Scotland Yard was unlike anything Tyler had ever experienced in his privileged 17 years of life. The sterile, institutional environment with its harsh fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable metal furniture was a stark contrast to the luxury accommodations he was accustomed to during his family's travels. As he sat in the sparse interview room, still wearing his expensive designer clothes that now seemed completely out of place, Tyler began to understand that his family's wealth and status meant absolutely nothing in this situation. Detective Inspector Margaret Hayes entered the room carrying a thick folder containing documentation of Tyler's incident, along with witness statements from multiple tourists and palace staff who had observed his behavior. With 23 years of experience in law enforcement, Detective Hayes had dealt with countless cases involving disrespectful tourists, but Tyler's case stood out due to the deliberate nature of his actions and the fact that he had live-streamed his harassment for entertainment purposes.
Mr.
Morrison, Detective Hayes began, her tone professional but carrying an undertone that suggested she had little patience for privileged teenagers who thought they could act without consequences. I want you to understand the seriousness of your situation. Your actions today constitute multiple violations of British law, and the fact that you broadcast your harassment of a military service member to an international audience makes this particularly egregious.
Tyler attempted to maintain his defiant attitude, though his voice betrayed the fear that was growing in his chest. I want to call my dad.
He knows lawyers, and they'll sort this whole thing out.
I didn't actually hurt anyone, so this is all just a big overreaction.
His response revealed how completely he misunderstood both his legal situation and the cultural significance of his actions. Detective Hayes opened the folder and spread several printed screenshots from Tyler's livestream across the table, each image capturing moments of his increasingly inappropriate behavior toward Lance Corporal Richardson. The photos provided undeniable evidence of Tyler's actions, and seeing his behavior documented in this official context made it appear far more serious than it had seemed during the heat of the moment. These images were captured from your own social media broadcast, Mr. Morrison. You created a permanent record of your violations, including verbal harassment of a military service member, physical approach beyond established security barriers, and deliberate disruption of a ceremonial military function. Detective Hayes pointed to specific images as she spoke, each one showing Tyler's behavior escalating from verbal mockery to physical intrusion. The teenager stared at the photos with growing horror as he realized that his attempt to create entertaining content had actually created evidence that could be used against him in court. His social media savvy had backfired spectacularly, as his documentation of his own bad behavior now provided prosecutors with perfect evidence of his intent and actions. Furthermore, Detective Hayes continued, we have received witness statements from 17 different individuals who observed your behavior, including retired Colonel William Ashworth, who attempted to intervene on your behalf before your situation escalated. Colonel Ashworth has provided a particularly detailed account of your dismissive response to his efforts to help you avoid exactly the situation you now find yourself in. Tyler's memory of dismissing the elderly man as grandpa now took on new significance as he learned the man's actual military background and credentials. The realization that someone with genuine authority and experience had tried to warn him, only to be rudely dismissed, added another layer of embarrassment to his growing understanding of how badly he had misjudged the entire situation. Detective Hayes pulled out another document that made Tyler's stomach drop even further. We've also been contacted by the American Embassy regarding your case. While they will provide consular services as required for American citizens, they have made it clear that they cannot and will not interfere with British legal proceedings when American tourists violate local laws. The mention of embassy involvement made Tyler realize for the first time that this incident had grown far beyond a simple misunderstanding that his parents could resolve with money or influence. The fact that diplomatic officials were aware of his case suggested a level of seriousness that his teenage mind had never considered possible when he decided to harass a palace guard for social media content. I need you to understand something very important, Mr. Morrison, Detective Hayes said, leaning forward slightly to ensure Tyler was paying complete attention. Lance Corporal James Richardson, the soldier you chose to harass, is a decorated veteran who served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious Queen's Guard. He has risked his life in service to his country, and your decision to treat him as entertainment for your social media followers shows a level of disrespect that we take very seriously indeed. Learning Lance Corporal Richardson's background hit Tyler like a physical blow. In his entitled worldview, the guard had been nothing more than a costumed performer, but now he was confronted with the reality that he had harassed a genuine war veteran who had earned his position through sacrifice and service that Tyler could barely comprehend. The guard's incredible professionalism in maintaining his composure despite Tyler's harassment now seemed even more remarkable and made Tyler's behavior appear even more shameful. Detective Hayes continued reading from the file, each detail adding weight to the case against Tyler. We have also received reports that your behavior disrupted the experience of numerous other tourists, including several families with young children who were visiting London specifically to see the ceremony. Your actions affected not only Lance Corporal Richardson, but dozens of other people who had done nothing to deserve having their cultural experience ruined by your attention-seeking behavior. The expanding scope of people affected by his actions was something Tyler had never considered during his harassment. In his narcissistic focus on creating content for his followers, he had been completely oblivious to the impact his behavior was having on everyone around him. The realization that families with children had been affected by his actions added another dimension of guilt that his conscience was struggling to process. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Tyler's parents were meeting with a representative from the American embassy and a British solicitor they had hastily hired to represent their son. Richard Morrison's usual confidence had evaporated as he learned the extent of the potential charges Tyler was facing and the reality that his business connections and wealth would provide no protection under British law.
Mr. and Mrs.
Morrison, explained solicitor David Whitman, an experienced criminal defense lawyer who specialized in cases involving foreign nationals, your son is facing potentially serious charges that could result in substantial fines, community service, and even imprisonment. The fact that he documented his own violations and broadcast them internationally makes this a particularly difficult case to defend. Patricia Morrison broke down in tears as the reality of their situation became clear. "We never taught him to behave this way," she sobbed. "He's always been spoiled, but we never imagined he would do something like this.
Can't we just apologize and pay whatever fines are necessary? We'll do anything to make this go away." Solicitor Whitman's expression was sympathetic but realistic.
"Mrs. Morrison, I understand your distress, but this case involves more than simple tourist misconduct. Your son's actions occurred at one of the most sensitive security locations in the country, and his harassment of a military service member during official duties is taken very seriously by British authorities.
Financial compensation alone will not resolve this situation."
The embassy representative, Consul General Patricia Williams, explained the limitations of what American diplomatic services could provide. "We can ensure Tyler receives fair treatment under British law and has access to legal representation, but we cannot interfere with the legal process. American citizens abroad are subject to local laws, and Tyler's actions clearly violated several British statutes." Back in the interview room, Tyler was beginning to understand that his actions would have consequences extending far beyond his time in London. Detective Hayes explained that regardless of the legal outcome, his arrest and the charges against him would become part of his permanent criminal record, potentially affecting his college applications, future employment opportunities, and his ability to travel to certain countries. "Your behavior was recorded by multiple witnesses and broadcast to an international audience," Detective Hayes pointed out. "Even if legal proceedings result in minimal punishment, the documentation of your actions will follow you indefinitely. Employers, universities, and other institutions regularly conduct background checks and internet searches on applicants." The long-term implications of his actions were something Tyler had never considered during his moment of supposed social media brilliance. His generation's tendency to live in the immediate moment, focused on instant gratification and online validation, had prevented him from thinking about how his actions might affect his future prospects and opportunities.
Detective Hayes then revealed information that sent Tyler into complete shock. "We've also discovered that your harassment of Lance Corporal Richardson was not an isolated incident of poor behavior.
Our investigation has revealed several previous instances of you posting disrespectful content about various individuals and institutions on your social media accounts." Tyler's social media history, which he had always viewed as harmless entertainment, was now being scrutinized as evidence of a pattern of disrespectful behavior toward others. Posts he had made mocking teachers, service workers, and other individuals he considered beneath his social status were being reviewed as evidence of his character and intentions during the palace incident. This pattern of behavior suggests that your actions at Buckingham Palace were not a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather consistent with your approach to treating others as objects for your entertainment, Detective Hayes observed. "This will be taken into consideration during sentencing if you are convicted of the charges against you." The detective then delivered news that would change Tyler's perspective forever. Lance Corporal Richardson has submitted a victim impact statement describing how your harassment affected not only him personally, but also his ability to perform his duties and his fellow service members who witnessed the incident.
Would you like me to read portions of his statement?
Tyler nodded silently, too stunned to speak as he prepared to hear directly from the person he had treated as an object rather than a human being. Lance Corporal Richardson's words would provide the final piece of understanding that Tyler needed to comprehend the full impact of his thoughtless actions and begin the difficult process of taking genuine responsibility for the harm he had caused. Detective Hayes opened Lance Corporal Richardson's victim impact statement with deliberate care, knowing that the soldier's words would have profound impact on the privileged teenager who had never considered the human cost of his actions. Tyler Morrison, she began, Lance Corporal Richardson has written about how your harassment affected him, and I believe you need to hear his perspective directly. She began reading in a steady, professional voice. During my service in Afghanistan, I faced enemy fire and life-threatening situations that tested my training and resolve. However, being deliberately mocked and harassed while serving my country in a ceremonial capacity, unable to respond or defend myself due to military protocol, created a different kind of stress that was particularly difficult to endure.
Mr.
Morrison treated me not as a human being worthy of basic respect, but as an object for his entertainment. Tyler felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he listened to the soldier's words. For the first time, he was confronting the reality of how his actions had affected another person on a deeply personal level. The guard he had dismissed as a robot was revealing himself to be someone with feelings, experiences, and a level of service that Tyler had never even attempted to understand. Lance Corporal Richardson's statement continued, what made this particularly painful was not just the disrespect itself, but watching other tourists, including children, witness this harassment. Part of our role is to represent the dignity and honor of military service, and Mr. Morrison's actions undermined that representation in front of people who had come to observe our traditions with genuine interest and respect. The soldier's words hit Tyler like a physical blow as he realized that his behavior had damaged something much larger than just one person's feelings. He had undermined the very institution he had been mocking, affecting not only Lance Corporal Richardson personally but also the military tradition he represented and the experience of every other tourist who had witnessed the incident. Furthermore, Detective Hayes continued reading, Mr. Morrison's decision to broadcast his harassment for entertainment purposes added another layer of humiliation, as it meant my professional duties were being mocked not just in person, but for the amusement of strangers around the world who viewed his social media content.
This revelation sent Tyler into complete emotional collapse.
The full scope of his actions finally penetrated his consciousness as he understood that hundreds or thousands of people had watched him harass a decorated war veteran for entertainment. His quest for social media validation had turned a military service member's professional duties into a viral spectacle that would exist online indefinitely.
Detective Hayes set down the statement and studied Tyler's reaction carefully.
After more than 2 decades in law enforcement, she had developed skill in recognizing when genuine remorse was beginning to replace defensive denial. Tyler's tears appeared authentic, and his obvious distress suggested that Lance Corporal Richardson's words had achieved something that legal threats and parental consequences had failed to accomplish.
Mr. Morrison, Detective Hayes said quietly, do you understand now why your actions were taken so seriously? This wasn't harmless fun or innocent tourist behavior.
You deliberately targeted someone who could not defend himself, documented your harassment for entertainment purposes, and showed complete disregard for both individual dignity and cultural traditions that millions of people consider sacred. Tyler nodded through his tears, finally, able to speak though his voice was barely above a whisper.
I never thought about him as a real person.
I just saw him standing there and thought it would be funny to get a reaction. I didn't know he was a war veteran or that he had feelings about what I was doing. I thought he was just like a statue or something. His admission revealed the fundamental problem that had enabled his behavior, a complete inability to see other people as fully human when they didn't fit into his narrow worldview of what mattered. His privileged upbringing had insulated him from having to consider the perspectives and experiences of people he considered different from himself. Detective Hayes leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more counseling than interrogating. Tyler, the fact that you didn't initially see Lance Corporal Richardson as a real person with feelings and experiences is exactly the problem we need to address. Your behavior patterns suggest you've been taught that some people exist for your entertainment, while others deserve respect based on their social status or wealth. The detective's psychological insight struck directly at the core of Tyler's worldview, forcing him to confront beliefs about social hierarchy and human worth that he had absorbed without question from his privileged environment. For the first time in his life, he was being held accountable not just for his actions, but for the underlying attitudes that had made those actions possible. "I want to show you something else," Detective Hayes said, pulling out a tablet computer. After your incident became public through news coverage and social media sharing, Lance Corporal Richardson received hundreds of messages of support from people around the world. Many of these messages came from military veterans, active service members, and their families who wanted to express their appreciation for his professionalism under difficult circumstances. She showed Tyler screen after screen of supportive messages, each one highlighting Lance Corporal Richardson's dignity and professionalism while criticizing Tyler's behavior. The contrast between the respect and admiration expressed for the soldier and the universal condemnation of Tyler's actions created a clear picture of how completely Tyler had misjudged the situation and his role in it. However, Detective Hayes continued, "Lance Corporal Richardson has also received some negative attention as a result of your actions. Some people have criticized him for not responding to your provocation, misunderstanding that his lack of reaction was actually a demonstration of exceptional military discipline, not weakness." This information devastated Tyler even more, as he realized that his actions had created problems for Lance Corporal Richardson even beyond the immediate harassment. The soldier was now dealing with uninformed criticism from people who didn't understand military protocol, all because Tyler had decided to use him as entertainment for a social media audience. At this point, Tyler's parents were brought into the room for a family conference that would determine the next steps in his case. Richard Morrison's usual authoritative demeanor had been completely replaced by obvious shame and concern for his son's future. Patricia Morrison appeared to have aged years in the few hours since the incident began, her carefully maintained appearance disheveled from stress and crying. Solicitor Whitman explained the plea agreement that had been negotiated with the Crown Prosecution Service. Tyler will plead guilty to charges of harassment and breach of the peace. In exchange for his guilty plea and cooperation, the prosecution has agreed to recommend a sentence that emphasizes rehabilitation over punishment, including community service, mandatory counseling, and a formal apology to Lance Corporal Richardson. The mention of apologizing to the soldier sent Tyler into fresh tears, as he realized he would have to face the man he had harassed and take responsibility for his actions. The prospect of looking Lance Corporal Richardson in the eyes and acknowledging the harm he had caused was terrifying, but Tyler was beginning to understand that this confrontation was necessary for both legal and moral reasons. Additionally, Solicitor Whitman continued, Tyler will be required to participate in a cultural education program designed to help him understand the significance of the traditions he mocked and develop genuine respect for military service. This program includes meetings with veterans, visits to military museums, and volunteer work with organizations that support service members and their families. The comprehensive nature of Tyler's rehabilitation program was designed to address not just his immediate legal violations, but the underlying attitudes and beliefs that had made his behavior possible. Rather than simply punishing him, the system was attempting to educate him and transform his perspective on service, respect, and human dignity. 3 months later, Tyler stood nervously outside a small conference room in a military support facility in London. His appearance had changed dramatically since the incident at Buckingham Palace. Gone were the expensive designer clothes and arrogant expression, replaced by simple, respectful attire and demeanor that reflected genuine humility and shame. The intervening months of counseling, community service, and education had begun the difficult process of transforming his worldview. Inside the room, Lance Corporal Richardson waited to hear Tyler's formal apology. The soldier had agreed to this meeting not for his own benefit, but because his commanding officers and the rehabilitation counselors believed it would be beneficial for Tyler's development to face the consequences of his actions directly. When Tyler entered the room, he was struck immediately by how different Lance Corporal Richardson appeared in civilian clothes. Without his ceremonial uniform and formal military bearing, he looked like what he was, a young man only a few years older than Tyler himself, but with experiences and maturity that Tyler was only beginning to develop. Tyler had spent weeks writing and rewriting his apology, working with counselors to ensure that his words reflected genuine understanding rather than empty remorse designed to reduce his legal consequences. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of months of genuine reflection and growth. "Lance Corporal Richardson," Tyler began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I want to apologize for how I treated you that day at Buckingham Palace. I understand now that what I did was not harmless fun, but deliberate harassment of someone who had dedicated his life to serving others. I treated you as an object for my entertainment instead of recognizing you as a human being deserving of respect." Lance Corporal Richardson listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but attentive as Tyler continued his carefully prepared apology. "I've learned about your service in Afghanistan and the sacrifices you've made for your country," Tyler went on. "I realize now how offensive my behavior must have been to someone who has risked his life in military service. I also understand that my actions affected not just you, but everyone who witnessed them, including other tourists and your fellow service members." The soldier remained silent for several moments after Tyler finished speaking, considering his response carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and thoughtful. "Tyler, I appreciate your apology, and it's clear that you've done significant work to understand the impact of your actions. What I hope you'll remember going forward is that every person you encounter has a story, experiences, and dignity that deserve respect regardless of their job, their appearance, or their social status." Lance Corporal Richardson's gracious response completed Tyler's transformation in a way that no amount of legal punishment could have achieved. The soldier's demonstration of maturity and forgiveness, even after being publicly humiliated, provided Tyler with a powerful example of the character and integrity he needed to develop in his own life. 6 months after the incident, Tyler was completing his final hours of community service at a veterans support center in London. His social media accounts, once filled with mockery and disrespect, now featured content focused on military appreciation and cultural education. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic. Tyler had genuinely developed new understanding and respect for service, tradition, and human dignity. The shocking outcome that would leave people speechless wasn't dramatic punishment or public humiliation, but rather the complete transformation of a spoiled, entitled teenager into someone capable of genuine respect and empathy. Tyler's story became a powerful example of how accountability, education, and direct confrontation with the consequences of one's actions could create meaningful change even in someone who seemed hopelessly self-centered. Years later, Tyler would credit this incident as the defining moment that changed his life trajectory from entitled privilege to genuine service to others. His experience taught him that true respect cannot be demanded based on wealth or status, but must be earned through character and treatment of others, regardless of their position in society.